After years of marriage, he ended it with a shrug and divorce papers for his young secretary he met a few months ago. I signed in silence and walked away. Then directly landed on his wedding day with an envelope in hand, his father's will. 300 guests watched as I read the clause aloud, and his entire empire collapsed before he could say, "I do." The invitation arrived on thick cream paper embossed with gold lettering that probably cost more per square inch than most people's hourly wage. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Blackwood request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration. I stared at the elegant script, my morning coffee growing cold in my hands. Richard was getting married. To her. To Jessica, his 25-year-old secretary with the perfect smile, ambitious eyes, and a body that had never carried children or weathered 34 years of life's disappointments. 6 months. It had been exactly 6 months since our divorce was finalized in that sterile courtroom downtown. 6 months since he'd stood in his penthouse overlooking Central Park and told me he was finally free to live authentically, free from our suffocating marriage, free to be with someone who truly understood his needs. What he'd really meant was free to screw his secretary without the inconvenience of hiding hotel receipts and deleting text messages. I set the invitation down on my tiny kitchen counter and laughed. Actually laughed out loud in my cramped studio apartment with its peeling paint and broken air conditioner. The bastard had some nerve, inviting me to watch him marry the woman he'd been cheating with for the last 2 years of our 8-year marriage. But then again, Richard had always been theatrical. Drama was his cocaine. He needed the high of grand gestures and public displays of power. He probably thought this was the ultimate victory lap, forcing me to witness his happiness, his success, his new life with his young, beautiful wife. He wanted me to see everything I'd lost when I'd failed as a wife. If only he knew what he was about to lose. I walked to my bedroom, if you could call a corner with a bed and a curtain a bedroom, and opened the safe hidden behind a reproduction Monet that had been the only piece of art I'd managed to keep in the divorce. Inside, nestled between my passport and the few pieces of jewelry Richard hadn't claimed, was a manila envelope that had been waiting for this exact moment. The envelope I'd been carrying around for 8 months, ever since that day at the lawyer's office when everything changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story doesn't begin with the wedding invitation. It begins with a phone call I received on a Tuesday morning in February, while the divorce proceedings were still grinding through the courts like meat through a sausage machine. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Harold Simmons from Simmons & Associates. I was your father-in-law's attorney. William Blackwood had been dead for 3 years, struck down by a massive heart attack while reviewing quarterly reports in his corner office. I'd liked the old man. He was gruff, demanding, sometimes cruel in business, but he possessed a fairness that his son had never inherited. He'd built Blackwood Industries from a failing manufacturing company into a billion-dollar empire through sheer force of will, 18-hour days, and an almost supernatural ability to see 3 moves ahead of his competitors. I'm sorry, Mr. Simmons, but if this is about estate matters, shouldn't you be speaking with my husband? We're currently going through divorce proceedings, and I'm not sure I'm the appropriate. Actually, ma'am, that's exactly why I'm calling. There's a provision in Mr. Blackwood's will that I need to discuss with you, something that's become relevant given your current circumstances. Could you come to my office this afternoon? I'd been living in the studio apartment since Richard had frozen our joint accounts and claimed the penthouse, citing some obscure prenuptial agreement clause I'd been too young and too in love to understand when I'd signed it. I was surviving on freelance graphic design work and the small savings account he didn't know about. Money I'd secretly skimmed from grocery budgets and birthday cash over the years, hidden away like a squirrel preparing for winter. I had nothing better to do than visit a lawyer who might have answers about why my marriage had imploded so spectacularly and why William Blackwood's name was still appearing on legal documents 3 years after his death. Harold Simmons' office was everything I'd expected from a family lawyer who'd served old money for 40 years. Leather-bound books, dark wood paneling, the faint smell of pipe tobacco, and decades of important conversations. Harold himself was elderly, with white hair that had probably been distinguished rather than simply old 20 years ago, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that had seen too many families destroy themselves over money. "Mrs. Blackwood, what I'm about to tell you is strictly confidential. Your father-in-law made me promise not to reveal this information unless very specific circumstances arose." He gestured to the chair across from his massive desk. "And I'm afraid those circumstances have now presented themselves." He opened a thick file folder, the kind lawyers use when they're about to change your life forever, and pulled out a document that looked both official and intimidating. Pages and pages of legal language in that tiny font lawyers use to hide important information. "Are you familiar with the terms of William Blackwood's will?" "Only generally. I know Richard inherited the company and most of the family assets. There were some charitable donations, provisions for longtime employees, a trust for his mother before she passed. Richard told me the details weren't important since everything was going to him anyway, and wives didn't need to worry about such complicated matters." Harold's expression darkened, the kind of look that suggested he'd heard similar dismissive statements from Richard before. "Your husband wasn't entirely truthful about the contents of his father's will." He turned the document toward me, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow marker, the legal equivalent of a neon sign. "This is Clause 15 of your father-in-law's last will and testament. It states that if Richard Blackwood remarries within 5 years of his father's death, that would be before March 15th of next year, then 51% controlling interest in Blackwood Industries, the family mansion in the Hamptons, the Manhattan penthouse, and approximately $800 million in liquid assets and investments will transfer immediately and irrevocably to Richard's first wife." I stared at the words, reading them twice, then 3 times, to make sure I understood correctly. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. "I'm sorry. What?" "Your father-in-law was very specific about this provision. He believed that Richard's first marriage, his marriage to you, represented a stabilizing influence that should be protected at all costs. He'd seen too many family fortunes destroyed by sons who abandoned their loyal wives for younger women, and then made impulsive, destructive decisions with generational wealth." My head was spinning. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck carrying a load of legal documents. "But Richard doesn't know about this clause?" "Absolutely not. William made me swear a blood oath, his words, not mine, to keep this confidential unless the triggering event occurred. He wanted to ensure that if Richard chose to remarry, it would be a genuine choice based on love, not one influenced by financial considerations or family pressure." I was quiet for a long moment, trying to process what I was hearing. Why would William do this? He barely knew me. I mean, we had dinner together maybe a dozen times in 8 years. Harold smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him since entering his office. "On the contrary, Mrs. Blackwood, he knew you quite well. He had you thoroughly investigated when Richard first started bringing you around. Background checks, financial history, interviews with former employers and college professors. William Blackwood didn't leave anything to chance when it came to protecting his empire. He had me investigated. I didn't know whether to be flattered or horrified. He was impressed by what he found. Your intelligence, your work ethic, your loyalty to his son even when Richard didn't deserve it. You came from a middle-class family, worked your way through college, built a successful freelance career before giving it up to support Richard's ambitions. William told me once that you reminded him of his late wife. Practical, grounded, someone who could keep Richard anchored to reality instead of floating away on clouds of his own ego. I thought about Margaret Blackwood, Richard's mother, who had died just 2 years into our marriage. She'd been kind to me, but distant. Old money polite, rather than genuinely warm. I'd never imagined she and I were similar. And if Richard doesn't remarry within the 5-year window, then the standard inheritance remains in place. Richard keeps everything, The company continues under his control, and this conversation never happened. Harold leaned back in his leather chair. But if he remarries before March 15th of next year, I become a very wealthy woman. The wealthiest woman in New York, actually. I left Harold's office in a complete daze. The legal documents tucked safely in my purse, like a winning lottery ticket I wasn't sure I wanted to cash. The February air was bitter cold, but I walked the 30 blocks back to my apartment anyway, needing time to think. The divorce proceedings suddenly felt different. Richard's eagerness to end our marriage, his constant talk about starting fresh and living authentically, his barely concealed excitement about his future with Jessica. It all took on new meaning. He was planning to remarry, probably as soon as legally possible. The man who'd told me he needed time to find himself after our divorce was already planning his next wedding. Probably to Jessica, though he'd never admit it during the proceedings. That would complicate things legally and financially, and Richard's lawyers were too smart to let that happen. But William Blackwood had been 3 steps ahead of his son, just like he'd been in every business deal for 40 years. I spent the next 4 months playing the part of the bitter, discarded ex-wife with Academy Award-worthy dedication. I fought Richard on alimony, not because I needed it, but because he expected me to fight. I made demands for property I didn't want, threw carefully calculated tantrums in lawyers' offices, played every stereotype of the vindictive ex-wife that he probably expected based on whatever Jessica was whispering in his ear, all while keeping the real prize locked away like a secret weapon. I hired a private investigator to monitor Richard's activities, not for the divorce, that was almost finalized, but to track his relationship with Jessica. I needed to know when they were getting serious, when marriage became a real possibility, rather than just my hopeful speculation. The investigator's reports painted a picture of a man desperate to prove his virility and success. Richard was spending money like water, taking Jessica on elaborate vacations, buying her jewelry that cost more than most people's cars, parading her around at industry events like a trophy he'd won for surviving his marriage to me. Jessica, for her part, was playing her role perfectly. Young, beautiful, impressed by wealth, eager to please. She'd quit her secretarial job, a move that Richard had probably encouraged to avoid any appearances of impropriety, and was now a full-time girlfriend dedicated to shopping, spa treatments, and looking gorgeous on Richard's arm. The divorce was finalized on a rainy Thursday in June. Richard got the penthouse, the vacation homes, the cars, the art collection that we'd built together during our marriage. I got a modest settlement that his lawyers had probably calculated to be just enough to avoid looking completely heartless, plus a small monthly alimony payment that would barely cover rent on a decent apartment. He was practically gloating at the final hearing, signing papers with a gold pen that had been a wedding gift from his father. "I hope you find happiness, Sarah," he'd said outside the courthouse, with that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate over 8 years of marriage. "Maybe now you can finally figure out what you want to do with your life, without my success overshadowing your own potential." "I'm sure I'll figure something out," I'd replied sweetly, thinking about the documents in my purse that would make him the laughingstock of New York's business community. What I wanted to do was wait. My private investigator's reports became more frequent and more detailed. Richard and Jessica were practically living together. Though they maintained separate addresses for appearances, he was introducing her to his business partners as his dear friend. She was accompanying him to charity galas and corporate retreats. They were shopping for engagement rings at Tiffany & Co. The 5-year deadline was March 15th. By my calculations, Richard had less than 9 months to make his move if he wanted to remarry within his father's specified time frame. Given his impulsive nature and Jessica's obvious eagerness to lock down her wealthy boyfriend, I was betting on a winter wedding. I was might. The wedding invitation arrived in early December, exactly 8 months after our divorce was finalized, hand-delivered by a courier service that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Mr. Richard Blackwood and Miss Jessica Chen request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration on Saturday, the 14th of February, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Valentine's Day, of course. Richard had always been theatrical, but this was over the top even for him. A Valentine's Day wedding to his young lover, just 1 month before the 5-year deadline that would trigger the will provision he knew nothing about. The venue was listed as the Blackwood family estate in the Hamptons, the same mansion where Richard's parents had been married, where we'd spent countless summer weekends during our marriage, where I'd once imagined hosting my own children's birthday parties and holiday gatherings. I RSVP'd immediately. Sarah Mitchell, I'd legally changed back to my maiden name, accepts with pleasure. I even checked the box indicating I'd be bringing a guest, though I planned to attend alone. The empty chair beside me would be reserved for William Blackwood's ghost, the architect of this elaborate revenge that was about to unfold. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a flurry of preparation. Though not the kind most wedding guests undertake, I had Harold Simmons draw up all the necessary paperwork for the asset transfer. I consulted with corporate lawyers about the process for taking control of Blackwood Industries. I even retained a public relations firm to help manage the media attention that would inevitably follow. Most importantly, I hired Marcus Chen, no relation to Jessica despite the shared surname, a photographer I'd known since college who specialized in documenting corporate events and high society gatherings. Marcus was talented, discreet, and willing to work for cash with no questions asked beyond the basic logistics. "You want me to photograph your ex-husband's wedding?" he'd asked when I called to explain the assignment. "I want you to photograph me at my ex-husband's wedding," I corrected. "Very specific shots that I'll describe in detail. Think of it as performance art with legal implications." I spent more on my outfit for Richard's wedding than I'd spent on clothing in the entire year since our divorce. A stunning navy blue dress that managed to be elegant without being attention-grabbing. Expensive enough to show that I was doing fine financially, but not so flashy as to upstage the bride. Professional hair and makeup that took years off my face and added a glow that could only come from deep inner satisfaction. Most importantly, I had a custom-made briefcase, soft leather, professional but not ostentatious, large enough to hold all the legal documents I'd be bringing to the party. The morning of February 14th dawned clear and cold. Perfect weather for what Richard probably imagined would be his perfect day with his perfect new wife. I took my time getting ready, savoring each moment like a fine wine. By this time tomorrow, everything would be different. Richard's world would be turned upside down. Jessica would discover what kind of man she'd really married, and I would control one of the largest companies in New York. The drive to the Hamptons gave me time to think about how much my life had changed in the past year. 12 months ago, I'd been Mrs. Richard Blackwood, living in luxury but feeling empty and unappreciated. I'd suspected the affair but had no proof, had felt like I was going crazy from Richard's gaslighting and manipulation. I'd been financially dependent, emotionally isolated, and convinced that my marriage's failure was somehow my fault. Now I was about to become one of the most powerful women in American business, and I was going to do it by exposing Richard's lies and hypocrisy in front of everyone who mattered to him. The Blackwood estate looked exactly as I remembered it. Sprawling grounds, manicured gardens, the kind of old money elegance that Richard had been born into and never fully appreciated. Cars lined the circular driveway like a luxury auto show. Valets in crisp white jackets directed guests toward the garden where the ceremony would take place. I recognized most of the faces from our years of marriage. Business associates of Richard's, country club friends, family members who'd been politely distant during our relationship and had probably celebrated our divorce with champagne toasts. They looked surprised to see me, though no one was rude enough to comment directly. Old money manners prevailed, even when everyone was dying to know why the ex-wife had shown up at her replacement's wedding. Jessica looked absolutely radiant in a dress that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. She was objectively beautiful. I had to admit that, with the kind of youth and confidence that comes from never having experienced real disappointment. Young, blonde, glowing with happiness and triumph, surrounded by bridesmaids who looked like they'd been selected from a catalog of perfect people. Richard stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking every inch the successful businessman he was. Confident, handsome, completely at ease with being the center of attention. He caught sight of me in the crowd, and his smile faltered for just a moment. A brief flash of confusion or concern, before he recovered his composure and turned his attention back to his approaching bride. I found a seat in the back row, close to the aisle. Perfect positioning for what I had planned. Marcus was already in position near the garden's edge, camera ready, waiting for my signal. This ceremony was everything I had expected. Expensive, traditional, completely focused on appearances rather than actual meaning or emotion. Jessica practically floated down the aisle, her dress trailing behind her like something from a fairy tale. Richard beamed as he took her hand, whispering something that made her giggle like a schoolgirl. The minister, some society chaplain who probably charged more for weddings than most people made in a month, droned through the standard vows about love and faithfulness and "till death do us part." All lies, of course, but beautiful lies, delivered with professional polish. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. This was my moment, the moment I'd been planning for 8 months. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress as every head in the garden turned toward me like sunflowers following the sun. The silence was absolute. 300 people holding their collective breath. Richard's face went pale beneath his wedding tan. Jessica looked confused and then furious as she realized who was interrupting her perfect moment. "I'm sorry to interrupt this beautiful ceremony," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the garden without shouting. "But there's something Richard should know before he continues with these vows." "Sarah, what the hell?" Richard started, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "I have some legal documents that I think everyone should see, especially the happy couple." I opened my briefcase with deliberate precision and pulled out the manila envelope that had been waiting for this moment. Harold Simmons stood up from his seat near the front. I'd asked him to attend as my legal witness, though I hadn't told him exactly what I was planning beyond ensuring all relevant parties are informed of their legal obligations. "This is a certified copy of William Blackwood's last will and testament," I announced, holding up the document like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Specifically, Clause 15, which I believe Richard was never informed about by his legal team. The garden erupted in whispers and murmurs. Wedding guests were pulling out phones, probably texting lawyers and business partners. Some of the smarter attendees were already calculating what this might mean for their own business relationships with Blackwood Industries. Clause 15 states that if Richard Blackwood remarries within 5 years of his father's death, then 51% controlling interest in Blackwood Industries, along with $800 million in liquid assets and the family's primary residences, will transfer immediately and irrevocably to Richard's first wife. The whispers became a roar. Richard looked like he'd been punched in the stomach by an invisible giant. Jessica's bouquet fell from her hands as her face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "That's impossible," Richard said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I would have known. My lawyers would have told me. There's no way my father would have." "Your father made his attorney promise to keep it confidential unless the triggering event occurred," I said calmly, enjoying every second of his public humiliation. "Which it's about to. The moment you say I do to Jessica, you lose control of your family's company and most of your personal fortune." "You're lying," Jessica shrieked, her perfect composure finally cracking. She grabbed Richard's arm with both hands, like she was trying to anchor him to her sinking ship. "Tell me she's lying, Richard." But Richard was staring at Harold Simmons, who nodded gravely and pulled his own copy of the will from his briefcase, holding it up for everyone to see. "I'm afraid it's completely true," Harold announced in his courtroom voice, the one he'd probably used to deliver bad news to wealthy families for 40 years. William Blackwood was very specific about this provision. He wanted to protect Richard's first marriage. The crowd was buzzing now like a disturbed beehive. Some guests were openly leaving, not wanting to be part of whatever legal and financial disaster was about to unfold. Others were edging closer, drawn by the spectacle of old money destroying itself in public. I could see reporters in the crowd, society page photographers who'd come to document a wedding and were now witnessing the business story of the year. Richard looked frantically between me, Harold, and Jessica, his mind racing through calculations of debt, assets, and legal obligations. There has to be a way around this. A loophole, a legal challenge, something. "I'm afraid not," Harold said with the definitiveness of someone who'd written the document himself. "The language is very clear and has been tested by multiple legal reviews over the past 3 years. Marriage to anyone other than Sarah Mitchell, your first wife, within 5 years of your father's death, triggers the immediate and irrevocable transfer of assets." "But we're divorced," Jessica screamed, her voice carrying across the garden like a siren. "She can't still be his first wife if they're divorced. That doesn't make sense." I smiled at her, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "Actually, Jessica, I can. The will specifies first wife, not current wife. Divorce doesn't change the chronological order of marriages. I was Richard's first wife, and I'll always be his first wife, regardless of our current marital status." Richard sank into a chair that one of the groomsmen had hastily brought forward, his perfect wedding day crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. I could see him running mental calculations. How much would he lose? How much would he have left? Could he survive financially? Could his ego survive the public humiliation? The answer to all those questions was not much, probably not, and definitely not. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. All his trademark arrogance evaporated. "Can we talk about this privately? Surely, we can work something out." "I don't think so, Richard. This seems like something your bride should hear, don't you think? After all, it affects her future too." Jessica was crying now, her perfect makeup streaming down her cheeks in black rivers. "This isn't fair. You can't just show up and ruin everything. This is our day." "I'm not ruining anything," I said pleasantly, like we were discussing the weather or the lovely floral arrangements. "I'm just making sure everyone has all the relevant information before making such an important life decision." The minister looked completely lost, his prepared script suddenly useless in the face of corporate warfare disguised as family drama. Wedding guests were openly leaving now, some pausing to offer me congratulations on my inheritance before heading to their cars and their lawyers' offices. "What do you want?" Richard asked desperately, and I could hear 8 years of marriage in that question. All the times he'd tried to buy his way out of trouble, all the problems he'd thought money could solve. "A settlement? Property? Name your price, Sarah." "I don't want anything from you, Richard. I want what your father intended for me to have. What he thought I deserved for putting up with you for 8 years." "But you don't understand," Jessica wailed, turning to address the remaining crowd like she was making a closing argument to a jury. "We love each other. This was supposed to be our day, our new beginning." I looked at her with something that might have been pity if I'd been feeling more generous. She really was very young, and probably genuinely believed that she and Richard were destined for happiness. "I'm sure you'll figure something out, Jessica. Maybe you can have a long engagement. Wait a year or two until the 5-year window closes in March." "A year or two?" Jessica looked at me like I'd suggested she wait a century. "I'm not waiting years to get married. I want to be married now. I want to be Mrs. Blackwood now." And there it was. The truth that everyone could now see clearly, displayed like a museum exhibit for all the wedding guests to examine. Jessica wasn't in love with Richard the man. She was in love with Richard the billionaire, Richard the lifestyle, Richard the social status. The moment the fortune was threatened, her enthusiasm for marriage evaporated like morning dew. Richard saw it too. I watched the realization dawn on his face as he looked at his beautiful young fiancée and finally understood exactly why she was there, exactly what she'd been after all along. "The wedding is off," he announced, his voice hollow and defeated. "What? No." Jessica rounded on him like a cornered animal. "We can fight this. We can sue her. We can challenge the will. We can't do anything," Richard said flatly. "The will is legal, properly executed, and ironclad. If I marry you, I lose everything that matters." "Then we'll build something new together," Jessica said, desperately, grabbing his hands and trying to force him to look at her. "We don't need your family's money. We have each other. We can start over, build our own fortune." Richard laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Build our own fortune? With what? My salary? Do you have any idea how much debt I'll be in if I lose the company? How much I owe in loans secured against Blackwood Industries' assets? How many investors will come calling for their money?" Jessica stared at him as the full implications hit her. No company, no fortune, no mansion, no lifestyle. Just Richard. Ordinary, middle-aged Richard without the trappings that had made him attractive in the first place. I need to think about this," she said, and I could see her already planning her exit strategy. The crowd had mostly dispersed now, leaving just the wedding party, immediate family, and a few dozen guests who were too fascinated by the drama to leave. Jessica's friends were already clustering around her, probably helping her figure out how to salvage something from this disaster. The photographers, both Marcus and the society reporters, were having a field day. This would be front-page news in the business section, probably with photos of Richard's face when he realized what he'd lost. "Wait," Jessica said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate edge. What if we don't get married today, but we still have the ceremony? Like a commitment ceremony? Would that trigger the will provision?" Harold consulted his copy of the document. The language specifies marriage, not ceremony. A commitment ceremony wouldn't trigger the transfer. "But then what's the point?" Richard asked. "You want me to pretend to marry you without actually marrying you?" "Until we can figure out a way around this," Jessica said eagerly. "Until we can challenge the will or find a loophole or something." I decided this had gone on long enough. "Actually, there's something else you should know." I pulled another document from my briefcase. "This is a promissory note from Richard's personal files. It appears that your father borrowed a considerable sum from a private lender to pay for experimental medical treatments for your mother. Treatments that weren't covered by insurance. According to this document, he borrowed $3 million at 12% interest." Richard's head snapped up. "What? That's impossible. I would have known about any debt like that. The lender was my grandmother's investment company. She specialized in private loans to wealthy families who needed discretion. When she died last year, the debt transferred to me as her heir." I held up the document, though it was complete fiction. "I'm calling in the loan, full payment due immediately." It was a lie, but a plausible one given the chaos of the moment. Richard had no way to verify the information immediately, and his mental state was hardly conducive to careful fact-checking. $3 million? Jessica's voice went up an octave. "On top of everything else?" "Plus accumulated interest over the past 4 years," I added helpfully. "Though I'm willing to negotiate the terms in exchange for a small favor." "What favor?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. "I want you to stand up in front of all these people, your friends, your business partners, your new wife's family, and admit that you cheated on me with Jessica for the last 2 years of our marriage. I want you to apologize for the lies, the gaslighting, the emotional manipulation. I want you to acknowledge that you systematically destroyed my self-confidence and made me believe I was crazy for suspecting what everyone else could see." The garden went silent again, The kind of silence that feels like the whole world holding its breath. Richard looked around at the remaining guests, his business partners who would be reconsidering their relationships with him, family members who had probably suspected the affair all along, Jessica's parents, who were just now understanding what kind of man their daughter had chosen. "Sarah, please," Richard said, and for the first time since I'd known him, he sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than just manipulative. "Don't do this. Not here, not in front of everyone. It's a simple choice, Richard." He was trapped and he knew it. The fake debt was just the final nail in a coffin that was already sealed. He'd lost control of his family's company, lost most of his personal fortune, and was about to lose the respect of everyone who mattered in his professional and social circles. "Fine," he said quietly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." "Fine," he shouted, his composure finally breaking completely. "Yes, I'm very sorry. I can't assist with that request." The admission sent another wave of shock through the remaining guests. Phones were definitely recording this. By tonight, the video would be all over social media and business news websites. "Very happy," I said. "Oh, and Richard, there's no debt. My grandmother never loaned your father money. She was a retired school teacher who lived on Social Security and savings bonds. I just wanted to hear you tell the truth for once in your adult life." His face went from pale to red to purple with rage. But what could he do? Attack me in front of 36 witnesses with cameras? Storm off and leave Jessica to deal with the aftermath alone? Call the police and report that his ex-wife had tricked him into telling the truth? Instead, he did what Richard always did when things got difficult, and he couldn't charm or buy his way out of trouble. He ran. He pushed through the crowd of remaining guests and headed for the mansion, probably to pack whatever belongings he could carry before the lawyers started seizing assets and the creditors started calling. Jessica ran after him in her wedding dress, the train dragging in the dirt, begging him to wait, to reconsider, to find some way to make this work. But it was too late for any of that. The wheels were already in motion. I stayed long enough to thank Harold Simmons for his discretion and professionalism, and to give my contact information to several very interested corporate lawyers who wanted to discuss the transition of control at Blackwood Industries. Then I walked calmly to my car, a modest Honda that would soon be replaced by something more appropriate for a billionaire, and drove away from the Blackwood estate for what I knew would be the last time. Behind me, I could see Jessica standing alone in the garden, still in her wedding dress, surrounded by the ruins of her fairy tale ending. Some of the guests were comforting her, but I noticed that several of the younger, single men who had been Richard's friends were already offering to drive her home. True love was apparently very transferable, especially when accompanied by a considerable fortune. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, corporate transfers, and media attention that made my head spin. The story of the scorned ex-wife who inherited a billion-dollar company from beyond the grave was irresistible to both business journalists and gossip columnists. I gave a few carefully controlled interviews, always emphasizing that I was simply honoring William Blackwood's wishes, and intended to run the company with the same integrity and vision he'd shown. Richard disappeared entirely within a month. Rumor had it he'd fled to his mother's family in Switzerland, probably to avoid the creditors who were circling his remaining assets like sharks scenting blood in the water. Without the company to generate income, his debts had become unmanageable very quickly. Jessica bounced back with impressive speed. Within 6 weeks, she was engaged to the heir of a pharmaceutical fortune she'd met at one of the charity galas she and Richard used to attend together. Apparently, true love could be found anywhere, as long as the bank account was large enough. As for me, I moved back into the family mansion, my mansion now, and threw myself into learning how to run Blackwood Industries. It turned out I had more of a natural aptitude for business than anyone had expected, including myself. Years of managing household finances, entertaining clients, and listening to Richard's business conversations had given me a better understanding of corporate operations than I'd realized. I also discovered that many of the company's best employees had been frustrated with Richard's leadership for years. He had ignored their expertise, squandered resources on vanity projects, and promoted people who flattered him, rather than those who produced results. They were ready for change, and I became the unexpected symbol of it. Let me know which city you are watching this from and if you liked my story, so that I can keep bringing more stories like this to you. Thank you so much for your support. I'm looking forward to your comments on my story.